It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. William Desmond, our next speaker this afternoon. William Desmond holds a David Cook Visiting Chair in Philosophy here at Villanova University, and we also share him with the Catholic University at Leuven, where he is the Director of the International Program in Philosophy. Professor Desmond's work is primarily in metaphysics, ethics, aesthetics, and the philosophy of religion. He is the author of 13 books, including the trilogy of works, Being and the Between, Ethics and the Between, and most recently in that trilogy, God and the Between. Professor Desmond's book, The Intimate Strangeness of Being, Metaphysics After Dialectic, just appeared with CUA Press, and later this year, the William Desmond Reader will be published by SUNY Press. Desmond's historical scholarship is impressive, ranging from Plato and Augustine to Hegel and Nietzsche. But what is most original and striking about his thought is his attentiveness to the practice of philosophy itself. Philosophy is, for Desmond, a practice of a mindful life, a mindfulness that calls above all for a fidelity to the givenness of being. As Desmond reminds us, this practice of philosophy should always make room for philosophy's others, those more originary sources of wonder to which our mindfulness is indebted, sources which certain practices of philosophy tend to eclipse. He names as philosophy's significant others art, poetry, and most importantly for today's conference, religion. In Desmond's thought, we encounter a generosity extended to these others and an invitation to look again with a renewed sense of wonder at what has seemed all too familiar in them. Today, Professor Desmond will be presenting his talk entitled Being True to Mystery on Saturated Phenomena and the Hyperboles of Being.
First of all, I want to express my thanks a second time to Paul and Derek and Darlene and Karen for all the work they've done in making this colloquium possible, and also express my appreciation of being able to speak in the company of such distinguished speakers. So my title is Being True to Mystery on the Saturated Phenomena and the Hyperboles of Being, and my paper is in a way two parts. First part I talk about different senses of being true, and in the second part I talk about the Hyperboles of Being, and will make a number of comparative remarks as to how I see them in relation to Professor Marion's saturated phenomenon. Mystery is often seen by philosophers as an epistemic nullity. We invoke mystery when we do not understand, when we cannot understand, when we are unwilling to try to understand. Mystery refers us to a limit, but one on which nothing of epistemic significance seems to happen. To grant mystery is to concede to mystery, hence to surrender to non-knowing, and thus to abdicate the challenge of knowing, whether this be philosophical or scientific. There's this further factor. Knowing and truth attained here, in this picture, are often seen in the light of determinacy and determinability. Mystery must be seen negatively in this light of the indigence of knowing, if to know is to know something intelligibly, which in turn is to know it determinately, or to be related to it in an in principle determinable manner. Mystery on this view shows itself as beyond determination and determinability, and as such it is a symptom of epistemic emptiness, a concession of the knower to sterile indeterminacy that hides its surrender to ignorance. I think this picture is not true of either truth or mystery, and it is interesting that some of the same things thus said about determinability could be turned in a direction that yields quite different perspectives. We might be referred to the beyond of determinability, where indeed there is a kind of poverty of knowing, but strangely this poverty is rich with promise. The promise of what I would call the over-determinacy of being true, indeed the over-determinacy of being. In this light, mystery could not be seen as the opposite of truth, except insofar as the latter is too rigidly tied to univocal articulation, clear, precise, and fixed determinacy. But such a determination of being true is not true to being true, nor is it true to the over-determinacy of being. So, my title speaks of being true, and this is deliberate in that I want to invoke a condition of being in between being and truth. This between being is reflected in the human participation in truth, known since Plato's recognition that we do not possess the complete knowing of the God, nor are we marked by the entire absence of knowing that we seem to find in the beast. In between, we know we do not know, otherwise we could not acknowledge our ignorance. But to be able to grant our ignorance is to know we do not know, and still this is to know. It is to know especially our desire for the true as an initially unwilled exigency to seek the true. This unbidden seeking is not something determinate, but opens our attentive mindfulness to all determinate things. Moreover, it is not defined at the outset by our powers of self-determination. We wake up to ourselves as not knowing before we know ourselves as desiring to know. There is an event of astonishment that carries us into the emphatic strike of an otherness that yet is intimately inward. The emphatic strike and the intimately inward pass into each other in the dawning mindfulness that we do not know and would know. What exactly it is, in a determinate sense, we do not know at the outset, and yet we wake up to ourselves as in search. We search, but again, we could not search did not some intimate intimation of what we seek companion our seeking. This again testifies to our being, or between being. But we seek, but only because seeking carries a promise of being able to recognize the sought, if the sought is indeed found, or if it perhaps indeed finds us. Without the promise of this enigmatic recognition, no knowing would be possible, no seeking would be enabled at all. We are seekers already in some enigmatic communication with what we seek, or it with us. So being true, I would say this has to do with a condition of being, a condition of being mindful about being. There is in this the call of a certain fidelity. Fidelity to what dawns in our waking up to mindfulness, fidelity to what strikes us into waking in its otherness to our self-determination. We do not construct any of this at the outset. It is prior to construction and indeed beyond deconstruction. For every construction and deconstruction presupposes it as enabling them to do their work. In this dawning, there is something intimate, indeed intimated. And we might even speak of a confiding. There is a kind of ontological confidentiality in the happening of being true itself, and a call to a fidelity to or with what communicates itself in the confidence. Of course, we are using the language of fides, of faith here, fidelity, confidence, confidentiality. There is a kind of intimate loyalty or claim of loyalty in the dawning of the mindfulness that we are to be true. I would also add that this ontological fidelity is something that one would have to consider more deeply both from the side of we who seek to know, as well as from the side of that which we seek to know. What is true is what remains true, and remaining true signifies a constant being with. Our constancy in the light of what communicates itself as constant, the constancy of what communicates itself as most ultimately reliable. That is, what we can most trust, what is most trustworthy in the happening of being. I have to water my vocal cords. And now I've read some pages, and probably it's best for me to read and summarize some of the things that I have to say here. So I would say something like this, that the sense of being true is said in many senses. Again, this is a large question here, but I find Aristotle's claim in the metaphysics that being is said in many senses to be extraordinarily important. And I think also one could adapt being said in many senses also to the notion of being true in many senses. And in my work, and again I'm summarizing here, I've tried to develop a quadratic orientation. Professor Marion at the end of his talk gave us a triadic, but the quadratic metaphysics that I would offer is an effort to respond to the triadic metaphysics of Hegel. But I would say this, I use very traditional notions of univocity and equivocity, and then I talk about the dialectical sense of being, and finally what I call the metaxological sense of being. The univocal is an orientation which stresses sameness and identity, sometimes to the exclusion of differences and multiplicities. The equivocal, by contrast, tends to recur to differences that are difficult to include within a univocal sameness. The dialectical, as I understand it, is an effort to mediate between sameness and otherness, identity and difference. And as I understand dialectic, we can find plural ways of practicing dialectic. In modernity, of course, Hegel's dialectic has tended to be the dominant one, or the one that has certainly had huge influence on how we have thought of dialectic and the aftermath of dialectic. But there are practices of dialectic, and I think of the Socratic and Platonic practice of dialectic, that are different to the Hegelian practice. In my view, the Hegelian practice tends to stress a form of mediation between sameness and others, which puts the stress on self-mediation or self-determination. Whereas, let's say, in the Platonic or Socratic, there's a certain openness to the mediation, which is not the same as in Hegel. So it's in that open space that I propose a metaxological sense of being, which gives articulation to a sense of pluralized intermediation beyond the self-determination of the same. The this between, is plurally shaped, and in a way, as a logos of the metaxou, it is closer to ancient practices of dialectic, for instance, Socratic and Platonic dialectic, than to the modern, such as Hegel. So what I'm calling a metaxological philosophy doesn't simply reject these other senses, but seeks to bring them into true alignment with their own promise of overdeterminacy, be it in the form of determination, indetermination, or self-determination. So this quadruplicity has to do, of course, with determinability, the sense of the indeterminate, the stress on self-determination that we find very strong in modern practices of dialectic, and then the question of what I call the overdeterminate. Is there an overdeterminacy that isn't just an indeterminacy, and that while it allows determination and indeed self-determination, can never, in fact, be fully exhausted by those two. And I think that that's at play in the question of being true, and also in the way being true brings us to a certain threshold of mystery. So I'll just say a few things here about this fourfold sense in relation to being true. And I would say that when the notion of univocity is in the dominant, we tend to have a view of truth as correctness. The stress again is here on determination and determinability. This was the first sense of truth which was mentioned in the previous paper. A proposition is true if, given its univocal enunciation, it corresponds one-to-one to a state of affairs, itself conceived as there with a clear-cut, fixed, cut-and-dried status. Now, I think there is an essential place for determinable truth in that sense, for without it we could not find our way in the midst of things. Yet the terms of the relation of adequatio or correspondence are not themselves so easily fixed in a univocal sense, nor indeed is the relation between them, nor indeed is the milieu of being within which these terms and their relations come to determinacy. So there's something more than determinate at work on all of these scores. So again, as I say, this was, in a sense, what I just said is on the threshold between the first and second senses of truth that Professor Marion mentioned in his talk. The equivocal sense of being, the equivocal has to be acknowledged, and this not merely in the sense of a problematic ambiguity that must be overcome with a univocal truth. The equivocal testifies to a doubleness of showing and concealing, to be true to which requires a finesse for ambiguity over which a more imperial univocity runs roughshod. If we were to use Pascal's terms, being true in the univocal instance calls on what he denominates as the esprit de geometrie, whereas being true in relation to equivocal showing and concealing requires the esprit de finesse. Of course, there are challenges to the task of being true here. Equivocity may seem so all-pervasive that we are inclined to despair of attaining the true. Some of the demands made on being true here are reflected in the traditional access to doubt, local or hyperbolic, or to the unavoidability of skepticism about the possibility of attaining truth at all. So I see the situation here as double. Skepticism may be unavoidable in relation to our failures to attain the true, but it also may be our honest confession that we do not know for sure. While the first seems a negative outcome, the second is not, since its very honesty is testimonial to the call to be true that is imminently at work in our very failure to attain the true. We must be true to the failure not to attain the true, and in being thus true, we remain on the path of being true, and hence there is no complete failure here. There is more the potential for the purgation of our porosity to the true. We are called into question by the failure, we call ourselves into question, but all of this means that the exigent call of being true is inextirpable in our seeking. Hence, while seeming to be outside the truth, it is revealed imminently to us that the call to be true is intimate to what we are. What is at stake here is not a simple indeterminacy, though there is an indeterminacy. There is an intimate porosity to truth in our being true. The dialectical and metaxological orientations do not shirk the challenge that can come up here, namely the very notion of truth itself being contested. The dialectical way nurtures the seeds of mediation that already is intimated in the equivocities of being true and the truthfulness to self, and to the imminent sense of honesty that we find there. The truth of the other has to be listened to, but in an interplay with a being true that is imminent in a communicative exchange between self and other. The interplay of one and an other are articulated along lines in which both are subject to the truth that is coming to manifestation in their communication. A truth in one sense immanent and in another sense transcendent, since it either subtends or overreaches the contributions of the partners in dialogue. Otherwise, no true communication takes place, and no communication in the unfolding of being true. Now, one of the traditional theories of truth that stresses this immanence of the true is sometimes called the coherence theory of truth. And essentially, not one side, not the other side, but all the sides of the matter, all the way to the whole of the matter, must be taken together to get the best sense of the truth at issue. The question for the coherence theory is whether it shortchanges what disrupts coherence, what resists inclusion in a whole marked by immanent relations that finally seem to rest fully at home within the immanent including frame. That is to say, the question of a more heterogeneous truth in excess of an immanent holism comes into play here. An immanent holism may not be true to the mystery of the overdeterminacy. The fullness of the whole is not the superplus overfullness of the overdeterminate. And if the interplay is plural, there can be the temptation to recur to a kind of inclusive univocity in the face of the multiplied equivocities. I see this not only in the coherence theory in general, but see it carried to an extreme in the modern practice of self-mediating dialectic, which reaches its consummation in Hegel's way of thinking. There is an interplay of self and other, but the other is a medial other and serves the dialectic as bringing to be a more ultimate self-determining mediation. The true is the whole, in Hegel's famous phrase. This is not untrue, but being true, as in the between, is more than the whole. The heterogeneity of the true over the immanent dialectic of being true is at stake in the metaxological understanding. So then finally, in the metaxological orientation, it's already been touched on in what I've just said, one is seeking to do justice to the overdeterminacy of being, beyond determination, indeterminacy, and self-determination. Moreover, the overdeterminacy is at issue with respect to both selving and othering, as well as the between relations in which and through which they are in communication. Both selving and othering have to be granted their truth and ask of us that we be true to both. There is an immanent otherness to selving, that is the threshold of the overdeterminate, in the intimacy of our singular being. There is an exceeding otherness of the milieu of being in its given there-ness, which communicates plurivocally. So I will come back to this plurivocal communication shortly in terms of the hyperboles of being as thresholds of mystery, but let me just round off this first half of my reflections with a kind of Augustinian thought. There is a kind of paradoxical doubleness. Intimate interiorizing of truthfulness is coupled with emphatic accentuation of the transcendence of truth as other. We recollect truth in inwardness. Truth, thus recollected, recedes beyond recollection. We face the perplexing enigma of the true as excessive, both intimately and transcendently. Always beyond us, always we are in quest of it, and yet the quest shows that already we are intimate with it. A metanoia seems required of us. Reverse the reversal of defining the true as only for us. Rather, it is for us to own that the truth for us, that the true is not for us to own. Otherness and interiority interface in the intimate universal. So that's the end of my first half, keeping an eye on the time, not to overstep the mark. So my second part, and here again I'll extemporize and read. Thirsty work. I'm really just surviving for the cocktail hour. I'm in the between, halfway between here and the old world. And they don't serve free cocktails on the airline anymore. So I'm as dry as a cork from my travellings. I actually come from Cork in Ireland, but that's just a bit of frivolity to break the tension. So I want to relate what I've said on being true to mystery, to what I call the hyperboles of being, and to what Professor Marion calls the saturated phenomenon. What I call the hyperboles of being, and this is something I've developed in that book, God in the Between, are happenings within immanence that yet cannot be entirely determined in the terms of immanence. Within the between of finite immanence, they bring us to its porous boundary. They communicate more than the terms of immanence can circumscribe, for they are happenings of opening to a sense of ultimate transcendence as other to the immanent between. The word hyperbole I also play with. I actually think that here we're always, in a certain sense, involved in figurative way of talking. Everything is figuring. Mathematics is figuring. We are configuring where we sense ourselves to be in being. Without figures, we cannot communicate our sense of what is given to us. But the hyperbolic is the figuration, but the sense of the Greek word hyperbole has that implication of throwing above or being thrown above. So that sense of directionality towards a sense of vertical excess is very much present in the hyperbolic as I use it. Again, to say a word or two about the saturated phenomenon, it is a marvelously suggestive idea, and Professor Marion situates himself as inheriting the essential insights of Husserl and Heidegger and extending them in directions that are significant and new. Again, this sense that the saturated phenomenon is understood in terms of a conditioning horizon and in terms of intention and intuition, and the fulfillment of the intention in the intuition of givenness. Again, this is Husserl. In the case of the saturated phenomenon, the conditioning horizon seems to give way, and the phenomenon, in a sense, is unconditioned. Moreover, there is an excess of intuition to intention, something exceeding intentionality, might one say a too-muchness and over-determinacy that yet is given. There is also what seems to be a reversal to what we often think of to be the normal priority of the transcendental ego, relative to which the phenomenon is defined as for us. Professor Marion also talks about us as the addressed, and the fact that the saturated phenomenon is such that it exceeds all concepts we might bring to bear on it. Different kinds of saturated phenomenon. He mentions a number in the history of philosophy that are very interesting. Descartes' idea of the infinite, for instance, Kant's idea of the sublime, and in that article on the saturated phenomenon mentions the painting as spectacle. A particular face I love, and finally the theophany at the end of the article, where he invokes Anselm's definition of God at the end as that greater than which none can be conceived. So there's a certain sense in which I find myself very much at home in that way of talking. I've been trying to think to myself not only of overlaps, but also of how differently I approach the issue. At one point I felt there was certain family resemblances, but then I was saying to myself, am I a first cousin? Am I a second cousin, first removed? First cousin, twice removed? You genealogists can figure out that. But one way that I might put it is that Professor Marion's work is very much defined by a development and reaction to transcendental philosophy. And in that article on saturated phenomenon, Kant and Husserl are particularly given attention to. Whereas I would say I pay more attention to Hegel in this sense that I see in Hegel already, and in German idealism, a response to some of the aporia of transcendental philosophy in the Kantian way of thinking. So there's a certain working through of certain antinomies present in Kant's transcendental philosophy in people like Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel. Speculative dialectic in Hegel's sense is already beyond subject and object. In a sense, it's between subject and object. In another sense, it is more than subject and object. And that's why my own engagement with the issues that are at stake here is very much with the view to trying to develop, let's say, a post-dialectical way of thinking, that sense of the between, which doesn't, in the end, cash itself out totally in the terms of a self-mediating or a self-determining whole. Now again, there are many nuances in Hegel. There are Hegelians here that I worry about bristling at any idea of questioning the master. But the fact is, I think that Hegel's system as a whole is governed by that triadic logic that is present already in my discussion of the modes of being true, namely indeterminacy, determination, self-determination. The teleology is all oriented towards a more complete self-determination. And I think that what I'm calling the overdeterminacy of being here is not systematically at work in the way he does philosophy. It also has huge consequences also for how one thinks about the nature of metaphysics and whether figures like Hegel in fact exhaust, consummate the possibilities of metaphysics. There is a phenomenology in Hegel, of course, the phenomenology of spirit, and I recall to myself that some years ago I wrote a piece which I called Surplus Immediacy and the Defection of Hegel's Concept. And this sense of surplus immediacy I took up with respect to Hegel's discussion of sense certainty in the phenomenology, where there's this drive towards the universal which is not attentive to the saturated phenomenon in Marion's sense at all. So there is a drive towards absolute knowing. I'll read a paragraph, and Hegel says it's where the goal is said to be reached when knowing no longer feels the need to go beyond itself. There is no more intimate strangeness and surplus otherness. There is nothing surplus anymore. That's my digital reminder. It wakes me up. I hope it wakes you up. I'm just trying to get to the absolute standpoint here, but that's okay. 30 minutes has gone, and I'm on track. I should be a Kantian, actually. You know, counting my. I'm walking around Königsberg, keeping up my pants. Okay, back to absolute knowledge. Okay, they're slow working jokes too. The saturated has to seep in, and then it hits a level which opens the porosity, and we guffaw. Enough frivolity, I'm wasting my time here. Okay. Hegel's absolute knowing, where knowing no longer feels the need to go beyond itself, whereas I say, by contrast, I would say that the more absolute standpoint, if we're talking about an absolute standpoint, is when knowing knows more than anything else that it must go beyond itself, go beyond being at home with itself, beyond its determinability and self-determination. In a poverty of philosophy, which just in its poverty is rich in communicative openness to the surplus otherness. This poverty is closer to the richer sense of being true, about which I talked just a little while ago. It is not an ignorance, nor yet again the resurrection of inquisitive curiosity that sets out once more on determination and determinability, nor yet is it the self-determination of cognition that would master being as other and also its own otherness. The poverty is on the threshold of the overdeterminacy, where its being true knows it does not know, and where a new ontological reverence for the mystery of being as intimately strange comes home to us again. In the remainder of my remarks, I wanted to say something about the four hyperboles of being, as I call them. The first one, the idiocy of being; the second, the aesthetics of happening; the third, the erotics of selving; and the fourth, what I call the agapetes of communication or community. And what I'll do is just read a paragraph where I describe what these hyperboles are, and then I'll make a kind of comment. So the first hyperbole of being, the idiocy of being. Given finite being shows a sheer that it is, which shines with an intimate strangeness. It happens to be without inherent necessity, and it might be called a surplus surge, but the question is it absurd? The surplus givenness makes all finite intelligibilities possible, but it is presupposed by all and is not itself a finite intelligibility. Its surplus stuns us into mindfulness about what gives it to be at all, since it does not give itself to be nor explain itself. The ontological patience of finite being makes mindfulness porous to what exceeds finite determination. To be as finite exceeds the terms of finitude itself. In being received as being, finitude is not simply thrown down in the between, but as hyperbolic and crossing the between, it is thrown above itself. So that's my description. And here is one remark, many more could be made, but this is one. There are those who limit, even reject the principle of sufficient reason. One can understand why the idiocy might suggest this limitation, even rejection. The idiocy as this primal ontological givenness is not the outcome of that principle, nor is it possible to make the givenness qua given more intelligibly determinate with respect to it. But this need mean no rejection of intelligibility. Rather, determinate intelligibility comes to be out of this more original givenness. This givenness is the incontrovertible being given to be of what is. There is an intimate strangeness to it, but this is not a mere empty indeterminacy. The rose is without a why, it will be said, and yes, it must be said. But what is the nature of the why at stake here? Clearly, it is not a determinate why we can specify, or a why subject to our self-determining reason. Yes, but givenness qua givenness can be responded to in a plurality of ways, not all of which put the why completely out of play. There is a why of wondering beyond the why of determinate curiosity. The latter may more faithfully serve the principle of sufficient reason, but the former, the why of this wondering, as surplus to determinacy, opens to the why of the overdeterminate givenness as such. This why it is in the hyperbolic dimension. So again, that's just, and again, as I say, given the time, I could say much more, but one of the places where I would look at is some early reflections on the part of Marion on vanity, where this sense of idiocy becomes drained of a certain significance and that sense of marvel. Levinas's Ilia, Sartre's sense of the viscous, the nauseous. But again, the relationship between us and the idiocy, in my view, can tilt in the direction of that sense of a dark givenness, but can it shine with that sense of a why beyond determinacy? This is the question. And in a certain sense, what these hyperboles do is bring us to a threshold where the question is what the nature of this mysterious givenness is. Second hyperbole, again, I read a paragraph. As I read this, I remember Hegel, my friend, and Hegel, as a teacher, he used to read paragraphs. If you know Hegel's encyclopedia, it's made up of paragraphs. But he used to read those paragraphs to his students. You read one of those paragraphs and be sure to bring your aspirin bottle with you. But then he would comment in a more extemporizing way for the sake of his students. Many of them, they took notes, and we know the notes. But notes from students can be notoriously unreliable. If they leave out the word not, you're saying this is, and suddenly it becomes a this is not. Anyway, the aesthetics of happening. Astonishment becomes ontological appreciation of the incarnate glory of the manifest creation, which, showing itself sensuously, exceeds finitization. Native to the material world, our nativity is saturated with rich ambiguity, resistant to our soon intervening domestications. Appreciation of immanence passes a threshold of immanence into mysterious love of transience that exceeds transience. This aesthetic overdeterminacy of finitude makes us porous on the boundary of finitude, and we are transported, as if moved by a music in things, into another space of mindfulness, hyperbolic to anything we can fix determinately in immanence. It seems to me that the aesthetic occupies Marion in many, many different places. The difference between the icon and the idol, for instance, is very relevant here insofar as an idol provides us with a kind of mirror in which, in the end, in its bedazzlement, we are reflected back to ourselves, whereas in the icon, that circle of self-relation is broken. So what I'm here calling the aesthetics of happening is very much in alignment with the second sense of the icon. And I think it's interesting to reflect that there is, throughout the philosophical tradition, a sense of the icon in a more generalized, again, this is not the icon, say, within the Eastern tradition. There's a sentence in Plato's Timaeus that I love very much. It runs something like this: Pasa nanka tonda ton cosmon icona tenes enai. It is altogether necessary that the whole cosmos be a certain icon. I know the philologists will argue about the significance of the word icon there, but there is an iconic sense insofar as the sensuous God, the theos aesthetikos, actually, as Plato or the Timaeus calls the given world, the icon is porous. It's not a reflecting mirror in which we are simply returned to ourselves. But I will just make a remark in relation to Kant, where obviously the aesthetic in the third critique has occupied a lot of discussion in recent decades. The notion of aesthetic ideas here and there is, in my reading of Marion, mentioned by him. But I'll just say something about the sublime, obviously mentioned by him, but I tend to be much more hesitant about Kant's notion of the sublime. For me, the equivocity of Kant is plain, leading to something which I would question. In Kant, the sublime is what he himself calls a subreption. Kant has these lovely words. Subreption occurs in the first critique. Transcendental subreption is when we attribute to the object what is, properly speaking, of the subject. And so there is no sublime other as such. There is no sublimity as genuinely other. The whole process by which we are brought low, because Kant acknowledges we are brought down by that sense of excess in the sublime, but then we're elevated by it. But the elevation comes in the end to our being elevated to ourselves in terms of our superior destiny as moral beings. It is our moral superiority to everything in nature that ultimately becomes the essential truth of sublimity. The entire process wends circuitously around to our moral sublimity. I do not think this is entirely wrong, for there is something sublime about us. But it is not right, however, on what is at play or what is kept out of play. Most of all, it underestimates the threshold nature of the happening that is between, as I would put it, the aesthetical, ethical, and between the religious and the sacred. Kant moralizes the sublime, and this moralization weakens the aesthetics of happening. It is unwilling or unable to grant the breakthrough of the equivocal communication of the sacred. The third hyperbole, the erotics of selving. and I guess I'm Platonic in some ways, but not just Platonic in any orthodox sense, whatever that is. I'm heterodoxly Platonic, whatever that is. The erotics of selving, the human being is intimately hyperbolic, as both finite and yet infinitely self-surpassing. You can see here echoes of Augustine. We are endowed with transcending power, but we do not endow ourselves. The immeasurable passion of our being as self-exceeding exceeds also the selving we are. It witnesses to a more primal porosity to what exceeds us. The erotics of selving is hyperbolic to a conatus ascendi that drives itself to its own most complete self-determination in immanence. The passio ascendi, the patience of our being, is marked by a primal porosity to what exceeds all determination and our own self-transcending. Selving is a word that I have hesitations with. It's a very modern word in some ways. Sometimes I like the word soul, but who has a soul these days? But there are people who sing soul music, and I wouldn't like to hear self-music exchanged for soul music. I think soul actually takes us down deeper into that more intimate porosity, out of which the process of selving perhaps crystallizes and seeks to endeavor to be. But I could just say that the sense of selving that I'm using here has a little bit to do with the way the word is used by that great Jesuit poet, Gerald Manley Hopkins. He has a beautiful poem called "As Kingfishers Catch Fire, Dragonflies Draw Flames." And some of the lines are the following, beautiful lines. Each mortal thing does one thing and the same, deals out that being indoor each one dwells. Selves, goes itself. Myself it speaks and spells, crying, what I do is me, for that I came. Now, it's a marvellous poem, and the latter part of it is much more evidently Christological, but I'll let that to the side for the moment. So, let me just again extemporize here, given the time. Normally, it's a very dominant consideration in the Western tradition, ultimately perhaps sourced in the Socratic Platonic view of eros, but we've tended to emphasize eros as a lack-seeking fulfillment. We desire what we lack, and we seek what we lack in order to attain a certain fulfillment. And while that is not entirely wrong, what I've tried to do in my own work is to exploit the ambiguity in the story of the parentage of eros, also told by Diotima, namely that at the conception of eros, you not only had penia as poverty, but also poros. And the word poros is obviously a Greek word, but it can signify, sometimes translated as plenty, but that's not really very good. It's related to the word porosity, in fact, and can signify also a gap or an opening, something, a way to come across. In any case, you know the story yourselves at the Feast of the Gods, to celebrating actually, I think, the birthday of Aphrodite. Poros gets drunk, these things happen even among the gods, and stumbles from the table of divine festivity, and somehow or other Penia manages to couple with Poros. So there was eros before eros. But we don't have to get into the technicalities of divine couplings. But my point is this. There is a porosity at the very origin of eros itself, but so to say, there is a sleeping festivity of the gods. There's a drunken divinity that is also there in the conception of eros. And making a leap, there's a certain sense in which in our very flesh, as erotically self-surpassing, something of that feast is working its way through us. And eros has something to do with a divine festivity waking up in the flesh, waking up to itself in the flesh. So I see here, in again, perhaps a heterodox way, a certain promise of the agape. Of course, agapeic is a Greek word, but I would say at the origins of eros, it cannot be disjoined from surplus festivity. even if in the scrabble of scarce life this is often lost sight of. Though again the poverty too partakes of a kind of porosity, being nothing, it is ready for all things other to itself. And of course there's again an equivocity here, because that being nothing can mutate into an eros tyrannos. I think the Greeks are very much to be listened to from the possibility of eros itself mutating into a tyrannical form, where instead of sort of the festivity of life, it becomes a despoiling of life. The sense of surplus is no longer the sense of a generosity, but the usurping surplus of pleonexia, wanting more and more than enough, beyond all satisfaction. Professor Marion has written a marvellous book called The Erotic Phenomenon. It would be an interesting question to ask him why he didn't write a book called The Agapeic Phenomenon. Maybe there is no such thing as an agapeic phenomenon, but I think that there is a happening of agape, and whether to describe it in the language of the erotics is the question here. And that brings me to my fourth hyperbole, and I'm almost finished. The fourth hyperbole I call the agapeics of community. Beyond selving or relation to others traverses the metaxou in receiving and in giving. The agapeics communicates a surplus generosity, not only in being receptive to the gift of the other, but in freeing us to give beyond ourselves to others. The giving again is the passing on of goodness itself. Giving on generously is the agapeic good of the to be. In the finiteness of our lives together, there is the promise of a generosity beyond finite reckoning. In the agapeics of community, there passes on a surplus good that makes itself available in an absolute porosity. Such an absolved porosity of the passio ascendi ethically communicates itself as a cum passio ascendi. This communication takes us to the limit of the ethical. In wording the between, it also raises the question of the incarnation of the holy. So, just final remark. I speak of the agapeics of communication because it most fully answers to the communion of surplus and emptying that allows the passage of love to circulate between many. Surplus. This clearly refers to the overdeterminacy in the hyperbolic dimension. It is a going beyond in the living sense, and it is a beyond with reference to our every effort to pin it to this determinacy or that, or to define it exhaustively in terms of our autonomous self-determination. It is in excess of these last two, but it isn't merely indeterminate, qua the living communication of surplus generosity. Emptying, surplus emptying. This refers to the manner in which the surplus opens a space of porosity for what is other to itself to come to be and to become itself. The emptying makes a way, poros, that is there as making way, and as making way, it seems not to be there, but it is there as not there to enable the being there of all that is other to itself. Being true to the agapeics of communication brings us closer to the overfull mystery. It is so full, it is as if there was nothing there, so full that we are nonplussed by it, but it is superplus to all determinate expectation and self-determining projection. So let me conclude simply by returning again to the point I was making earlier in the paper about our between being. And we are between beings in relation to being true. The beast does not know, it does not know. The God knows, it knows. The human being knows, it does not know, and thus knows, though it does not know. This last is a complicated double condition between empty and full, and both empty and full, and neither empty nor full. It seems like something entirely equivocal, even duplicitous, but the question is whether this duplex being is just duplicitous or rather saturated with an equivocity that it must seek to intermediate. Even then, this may mean that the human being will never absolutely dissolve the equivocity through itself. To do so through itself alone would be perhaps to reiterate the equivocity. And perhaps the equivocity is not a duplicity to be replaced by univocity, but a mystery whose excess affirmatively constitutes the condition of between being as such, a mystery whose intermediation yields an understanding that does not cause the mystery to evaporate, but rather comes to know the mystery at depths of astonishment that will never be dispelled. Thank you. Sure, one question. Half a question. Jack. Yeah. Well, it's not speculative in the Hegelian sense, certainly, and it's not phenomenological in the sense in which you're using phenomenological, but it is phenomenological in the broader sense of being open to what shows itself. It's phenomenological, so to say, in a reformed Platonic sense, where for me, Platonic philosophy is being mindful in the midst of things and being attentive to what not only shows itself in the given world, but also attentive to what people say about what shows itself. So if it is phenomenological, it's one that has serious hesitations about going through that whole process of phenomenological reduction, transcendental reduction, and so on. It also has serious reservations about the claim that we're post-metaphysical. The sense of metaphysics, and I hinted at it briefly, for me would not be so much defined by, say, Aristotle's three senses of the task of metaphysics, or perhaps the later scholastic metaphysics generalis, metaphysics specialis. It's more, the to be is said in many senses. And I don't think that one needs a philosophical method to be in the midst of things. One does need transformations of mindfulness, but they are not simply effected through or patterns of self-determining thinking. There's a passivity even to the beginning of what it means to be a philosopher at all. So it doesn't fit in. As I understand the contrast that you offered there, I don't find myself at home in either of those two ways of describing my work.
Thank you very much. We'll reconvene at 3:30 for our final paper. Thank you.